Welcome back to Apology Accepted, a YouTube channel dedicated to Christian apologetics, critical thinking, and investigative analysis of the collision between worldviews. This third installment of the Building Block series dives into universal morality and the issues atheism has addressing morality. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to ring the notification bell to be notified of new episodes, subscribe, share, and like the video to tell the algorithm overlords that this content should be suggested. Let's dive in. What is right and what is wrong? Depending on your view of the world, and especially the origin and defining characteristics of man, your answers may vary. Some acts are nearly universally viewed as right, and some universally viewed as wrong. Let's take a quiz on a few. Murder? Wrong. Rescuing a drowning child? Right, and valiant. Assault? Wrong. How about assault below the belt? Very wrong. How do you feel about genocide? Super wrong. Racism? Also very wrong. Some of these actions are bound to elicit stronger responses than others, and I'm sure even the mention of some may have caused you to cringe or worse, and rightfully so. But what if I told you that some of you who are watching this video right now have absolutely no basis to cringe at genocide, murder, grape, or even racism? What if I told you that not only do your feelings violate the laws of logic and lack a sound basis, but actually they prove that there is indeed a God and you are made in his image? And before you recoil against the claim I have just made, hear out the argument with an open mind and then draw your conclusions. Perhaps I am a lunatic, perhaps I am a liar, or perhaps Jesus really is Lord, and you object to the atrocities I have listed because he has ingrained it into your heart. A pretty basic and sound definition of universal morality is as follows. Universal morality refers to a set of ethical principles that are universally applicable to all human beings, transcending cultural, historical, and personal differences. This concept hinges on the belief that there are objective moral truths that hold regardless of individual perspectives or societal norms. Such a universal moral framework contrasts sharply with moral relativism, which posits that moral values are subjective and can vary significantly between different cultures and individuals. To add to the concept, we should distinguish between subjective and objective morality as well. Subjective morality is contingent upon personal or cultural beliefs and can shift based on circumstances or opinions. In contrast, objective morality asserts that certain moral principles are inherently true and binding, independent of human opinions or beliefs. These principles are unchanging and apply universally, forming the cornerstone of universal morality. I just told you that you may be watching this video recoiling against the mere mention of such horrible atrocities as genocide, racism, grape, and murder with absolutely no basis for doing such. This is a good time to ask yourself if you are a moral subjectivist. This is where things often get a bit muddy for the atheist. While some issues like slavery have a fairly universal disdain in modern atheist Western culture, the same could not be said for such issues as pornography, the modern Rainbow Brigade, or even, perhaps shockingly as of late, enjoying the playground. Essentially, most atheists will openly advocate for moral subjectivism while acting as moral universalists only in certain scenarios. Here's an example of what I mean, and I will use modern, top-of-mind issues to make it clear. If I were to walk up to you on the street and ask you about slavery, it is very likely that your answer would portray the act of chattel slavery as a grave injustice, atrocity, or some such other strong condemnation. If I were then to ask you about the Rainbow Brigade, abortion, or some other hot-button topic of today, you might tell me that everyone gets to decide what is right for themselves as long as they aren't hurting anyone else. Some of you listening may already see the issue here. On the one hand, you might say it is always wrong to enslave someone as a matter of calling them your property, puff out your chest, and say, "Not if I were around," asserting your sure and clear moral standard against such an act, and even condemning those who partook in such behavior to a life behind bars or even death. But on the other hand, you will pick and choose issues, as you please, to allow to be morally subjective. So, slavery is always wrong, but the majority of people now say that X, Y, or Z is fine, so now it is morally acceptable, and each individual is permitted to decide for themselves, barring that it doesn't hurt anyone else. Of course, that standard is arbitrary in the first place. What standard are you using to determine that hurting someone else is the standard by which to draw the line where morality shifts from subjective to objective? Isn't this arbitrary standard in and of itself claiming to be objective? Where did you get it from? Was this simply decided on by the current cultural majority? How do you know that this dividing line between objective and subjective moral standards even exists in the first place? What if it didn't? What would this do to your entire worldview? We have established, and I hope that you have established for yourself, where you currently stand in terms of morality's objectivity versus subjectivity. Let's focus first on the moral subjectivity. If you are an atheist listening to this episode, I imagine that I have previously summarized your worldview somewhat accurately, as this seems to be the current position held by the majority. If not, I am not excluding you from this segment, as everything will still apply. I'm just not using your specific worldview as an example. So currently, we will assume that the line between moral objectivity and subjectivity stands at harm to someone else. This is what the predominant Western culture currently holds to, and as the moral subjectivists would hold to, the majority gets to decide between right and wrong. So, let's do a little time traveling back to the early 18th century. The practice of slavery was alive and well, and virtually no one was imprisoned globally at the time for practicing it. You heard me right, globally. Slavery had been a cultural norm and standard that had been being practiced since virtually the beginning of mankind. So, as a moral subjectivist in some areas and objectivist in others, how is it exactly that you would appeal to the slave owner to release his slaves and to the state that those slave owners should be forcefully removed from their homes and placed behind bars or killed? This is going to require a rather bold claim, as you are in the early 18th century and you won't be able to simply appeal to the modern cultural moral consensus. So what exactly would you say to a slave owner? You can't do this because it is hurting someone else. Why not? Where did you get that idea from? What authority do you have to dictate morality to me? This is my slave, and the state says it's allowed, so it is. Well, you might opine, just because the state says it's okay doesn't mean it actually is. May I ask again, by what standard exactly? Who are you, even in 2024, to condemn the plantation slave owner of the 18th century? If you haven't realized the problem yet, here it is plainly. If you are the standard bearer of morality, then you have no right to imprison or punish anyone else for any of their behavior, regardless of how heinous the behavior is in actuality. If every person simply appeals to themselves as the standard, then the majority on any given issue simply wins by brute force. This may excite some of you listening now as you hearken to what you may consider various major civil rights victories won in the last century or more, but ask yourself this: how did these old cultural injustices come to be in the first place? They came to be by the very same moral subjectivism you champion as the means for their abolition. In the late 1930s and early 1940s in Germany, it was perfectly acceptable to culturally discriminate against Jews, blacks, gypsies, and a large manner of other individuals, leading to internment and eventually attempted extermination. Prior to the late 18th century, slavery of all manner of all individuals was the norm. Some people were just born slaves, and others were just born free. From a cultural perspective, In Rwanda in 1994, it was perfectly acceptable culturally for the Hutu tribe to eliminate the Tutsi tribe through genocide, resulting in the deaths of over 1 million Tutsi Africans. Language barrier aside, what would you tell the members of the Hutu to stop such a genocide? How would you shift the culture of death and brutality that ruled the region in such a manner? What convincing argument do you have to convince the Hutu that giving up the not yet won spoils from their genocidal raid for tomorrow is actually the right thing to do? After all, from a naturalist perspective, it benefits them greatly to kill their neighbor and pillage his belongings as his lifeless body is callously discarded into a burning pit without remorse. Furthermore, if the theories of macroevolutionary origin for the human race are true, isn't the Hutu simply doing what he has evolved to do? Isn't he merely eliminating the weaker genes of his defenseless neighbor who wasn't intelligent or capable enough to defend himself, his wife, children, and belongings? And what makes you better? How do you know you wouldn't follow the culturally accepted morality of their era? How do you know you wouldn't own a slave for the profitability of free labor on your farm, which provides necessary income to your family? What compelling moral standard would be strong enough that you would hide your Jewish neighbors in your basement in Germany at the risk of losing your own life and your family's? In an argument with your spouse over the matter, they say that it is wrong to risk paying the price for someone else, yet you feel otherwise. What now? If you decide against the will of your spouse to hide your Jewish neighbor and your spouse and children are killed as a result, didn't you violate the "as long as it doesn't harm someone else" clause of your subjective morality? Are you then really to conclude that it was wrong for you to attempt to save your neighbor from a horrific death as a result of their bloodlines? I think you can understand at this point why I would state that if we would like to have a society free from genocide, rape, murder, or other heinous crime, we are going to need an objective standard by which to do so. I have established the need for an objective standard. So what exactly does this mean? Well, put simply, we are going to have to point to something that can be clearly understood and applied to differentiate right from wrong and allow that to be the uncontested provider of this differentiation. If we begin to challenge the standard, we just run right back into the issue of moral subjectivism as we subject the objective standard back to our own preferences, leaving the standard toothless and entirely ineffective. So it must be all in or all out in order to follow the law of non-contradiction as we covered in episode 2. This means we must have a law or universal truth that must be timeless, unchanging, and applied to all people regardless of their culture or location. This law is then what we must model our justice system after, providing punishments for those who violate this universal law. Certain violations of this universal law are punished by the society we live in through the power invoked and held by the state in civilizations and societies globally. At this point, we are building on arguments from the Kalam and the laws of logic that are being invoked. If you haven't watched those 2 episodes yet, I strongly encourage you to do so as we are building upon the foundation of these principles, as the name for this series, Building Blocks, implies. What if I told you that Christians abolished slavery in the United States and in the world broadly? What if I told you that it was Christians that held Jews in their basements in Nazi Germany? The question is, why? So to answer the question of why someone would lay down their life in service of freeing a slave or hiding a Jew, we have to understand the Bible itself as a universal moral standard. Atheism lacks a universal objective standard, as its own claims are entirely catered to survival of the fittest, evolution, and lack any universal lawgiver or standard to point to. The law of the jungle, as it were, is for man simply to do as best benefits and suits himself. This is what animals do and is the only observable and objective standard given the worldview that we are all nothing more than highly evolved animals. This is where we find traditional religion. To be clear, atheism is a religion, but that is a topic we will cover in a later video. So for now, we will simply define religion colloquially to refer to belief systems involving supernatural beings possessing a will and the ability and characteristics that would define them as a creator of our universe and us as human beings. So for Muslims, Allah and the Quran provide what they believe to be the universal objective morality of the universe. Mormons, the Book of Mormon, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower, so on and so forth. But this is a Christian apologetics channel, and I am a Christian, so we will be talking about the universal standard of the Bible. I won't leave this assertion unqualified, however, as we will be comparing the legitimacy of claims made by all of these religions and more in future videos. For now, however, let's talk about the Bible and its moral standards. The Bible, I would assert, is the Word of God given to His image bearers, us. This word tells us about His nature as well as our nature and the laws of the universe, both physical and moral. He created the universe and therefore has the only legitimate authority over its governance. He also created all of the laws by which the universe operates and therefore is the only one who can tell us about them with ultimate authority. While physical laws can be observed through the scientific method, some moral laws must be provided to us explicitly. Other moral laws, however, are ingrained in our hearts and are evident in nature, as Romans 1:18-22 states. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. The Apostle Paul continues in Romans 2:14-15, which states, For when Gentiles, who do not have the law, by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. With this in mind, God provides the Bible as a historical record, proof of His omniscience through prophecy, and importantly, a written declaration of the moral standard inherent to the universe, both perceived naturally and unperceived. It is the ultimate standard we point to when examining moral claims and thinking through the moral gray areas presented to us in life. So what does the Bible say about slavery? The Bible states that humans are image bearers of God. In Genesis 1:27, this is made clear. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female, He created them. Now, to do a little bit of exegesis on this verse, this is, at least in some part, recognized by most Christians to involve our free will, just as God, an immaterial being, would be best described as having the unique and innate ability to will, being the marking characteristic of His invisible image. He alone could will, and in this image we were created, providing us with the ability to will just as God does. Of course, it is worth mentioning that we do not possess the ability to will things into existence, but we do have the will to decide things for ourselves and act on those decisions according to our abilities. This principle of free will and being made in God's image are the very foundation by which Christian abolitionists stood before the state and demanded the release of all slaves and the abolition, therefore, of its practice. The act of enslaving image bearers of God violates the very image of God that we were made with. Racism does the same, by the way, as it denies that all men were made in the same image. This refutes any argument Charles Darwin might have about black people being a few steps behind in the evolutionary process and therefore providing a racial hierarchy. Moreover, Exodus and Deuteronomy clearly condemn the practice of chattel slavery. For example, Exodus 21:16 says, He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. Remember how I mentioned earlier that atheism lacked the ability to put a slaver to death? Well, this verse is why I mentioned it. The Bible provides a standard by which not only to condemn the slaver, but the just punishment is also provided, which is death. Christians understood this when they spearheaded the abolitionist movement in the 19th century United States. William Lloyd Garrison is one such notable example. In the early 19th century, Garrison was the author of a publication called The Liberator, a publication dedicated to calling for the immediate abolition of slavery in the United States and the world more broadly. Garrison fought feverishly for the rights of enslaved Americans to be set free and railed against the suggestions of repatriation to Liberia. Garrison held to the American Anti-Slavery Society's view that, quote, slaveholding is a heinous crime in the sight of God, and that, quote, duty, safety, and the best interests of all concerned require its immediate abandonment without expatriation. This view held the likes of Garrison as an object of the ire of anti-slavery incrementalists, those who called for repatriation to Liberia for all freed slaves, and the Southerners who upheld the supposed legitimacy of the slave trade. Garrison would be ultimately arrested and tried for libel due to his writings condemning an organization involved in the slave trade, as well as receiving death threats, including being burned in effigy. Garrison clung staunchly to scripture, appealing to God's hatred of the practice of slavery, and is one of countless examples of men who fought effectively and voraciously in the service of freeing the slaves in the United States on the basis of scriptural appeals. Ultimately, this effort would be successful, and the Christian abolitionist movement is largely responsible for ending slavery in many regions of the world today. On a side note, I would like to address a challenge up front that claims the Bible legitimizes and upholds the practice of slavery. The atheist may point to Exodus 21 verses 20 through 21, which states, "And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property." Context is needed to understand these verses properly for what they are saying and are not saying. The Bible in these verses is not upholding the practice of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery involved the sole ownership of individuals as property, subjecting the slave to the unfettered will of his master. As a chattel slaver, killing a slave would have been perfectly acceptable, as the slave was seen as property with which could be done as pleased the owner. In the context of Exodus, however, the practice of slavery was one more akin to indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a type of voluntary slavery in which an individual with an insurmountable debt or lacking the means to financially care for themselves or family would be taken in as a slave by a master, who would provide the means of living or consider a debt repaid in exchange for labor. An indentured slave could be freed if their debt was paid and possessed full human rights as individuals worthy of dignity. These verses actually uphold the dignity of slaves, stating that corporal punishment, a cultural norm of the time for laborers, could not exceed what was reasonable and slaves could not be killed. If the slave's master were to kill a slave intentionally, he would be punished. The punishment at the time for murder was death, as Genesis 9:6 states, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man." Exodus 21 is dealing specifically with the difference between manslaughter and murder as it regards slaves. In the first verse, it is calling for punishment for the murder of a slave by his master. He would then subsequently be killed. In the second instance, when the slave lives for a few days before dying, the writer, presumed to be Moses, writes that punishment for manslaughter, which was monetary in Jewish culture, would be counted as the loss of his slave. This is what the "he is his property" portion of verse 21 refers to. The fact that the slave were to live for multiple days following their punishment points evidentially to the fact that the death was unintended consequence of their corporal punishment, and was therefore ruled as what we would call modern-day manslaughter. Just a few verses later, we get even more evidence of the humane requirements for this arrangement that largely deals with those in crippling debt or poverty. Exodus 21:26 through 27 states, "If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let them go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. Now I am guessing that you have heard of the phrase an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This derives from Leviticus 24:19 through 22, which says, If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, as he has caused disfigurement of a man, so it shall be done to him. And whoever kills an animal shall restore it, but whoever kills a man shall be put to death. You shall have the same law for the stranger and for one from your own country, for I am the Lord your God." The verses in Exodus 21:26 through 27 is stating that freeing a slave who has so much as lost a tooth is recompense for the offense. In other words, the master can keep his tooth, but the slave must be set free without compensation to the master. It helps to remember that this form of slavery was often a means of debt repayment, and a slave being freed was a statement of that debt being paid in full. The Bible in Exodus is importantly upholding the dignity of slaves and providing strict rules by which the arrangement must abide, thereby protecting the dignity and image-bearing of the slave. Much more can be said in a full exegesis of the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy and their profound nature within the culture which they were written, but for the sake of time, that will be the extent we cover this topic in this video. If you would like a more robust and complete understanding of the slavery in Exodus, I would recommend Mike Winger as a fantastic resource whose content I will link below. What are human rights? Where do they come from? The atheistic worldview has a major conundrum to solve as it attests to the accuracy and legitimacy of macroevolutionary processes being the cause and origin for human life. If this is true, then do animals have the same rights as humans? What makes a human special enough to have supposed unique rights among the animal kingdom? Now, to be fair to the atheists in the audience, there are those who are consistent in their beliefs and either elevate the rights of animals to be equal with those of humans or devalue humans to claim that they have the same rights as animals. This view is consistent and comports with the internal consistency that we would require from such an argument. However, I am guessing that many of you do not believe we should be on the same level as animals. I mean, all manner of animals murder, grape, and steal from each other all the time. Do we really want to live as animals in a society like that? Or perhaps instead we should put tigers and chickens on trial. Either way, these don't sound like they are tenable solutions. So the atheist again is left with no real appeal to anything other than an evolved mind that allows us to make up arbitrary standards that the other members of the animal kingdom have not yet come to the realization of. But what compelling argument do you have that would compel one to die if necessary in the service of defending another person's human rights? Only an objective moral standard can do this. After all, why should you give your life for the subjective morality of a given society if that society could simply conclude the cause you died for wasn't just after all and abandoned its pursuits altogether? Let's contrast this with the Bible's support of the ideal of human rights and the timeless objective morality that compels Christians the world over to die in service of freeing the oppressed. We have already outlined the creation of man in God's image in Genesis, so we won't rehash that again, though it is obviously relevant and requires mentioning here. The Bible upholds the rights of the weak and defenseless in Matthew 25:40, which says, "And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of my brethren, you did it to me." In this verse, the Bible counters the naturalist worldview, which states that only the fittest should survive. This verse runs contrary, stating that what we do for the poor and needy we have done for Jesus himself. This upholds the commonly referred to right to life, as Jesus does not believe that any person based solely on status lacks the right to life, and he commands his disciples to help those of a lower status. The second right I am going to talk about is the right to self-preservation or self-defense. This right is the fundamental right from which all others can exist, according to the framers of the US Constitution. This is logically necessary, as the right to life cannot really be a right if you are subject to a murderer slipping into your house at night to kill you. So logically, if you have the right to life, you must also have the right to defend your life. This right goes hand in hand with the right to bear arms mentioned in the Second Amendment of the US Bill of Rights. The reason for this is simple. If all people have the right to life, and therefore the right to self-defense, then what about women and children or the physically disabled who would not have the ability to effectively do so when forced? Well, due to the firearm's ability to be effective and lethal with minimal training and physical capability when compared to hand-to-hand or melee combat, the age-old saying is derived that God created man and Samuel Colt made them equal. All manner of personal weaponry is covered by this right to arms, as it is up to the defender to determine their weapon of choice based on their own unique circumstance. The Bible, as you can imagine, very clearly upholds this right to self-defense. Exodus 22:2 states that, "If the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed." This verse very clearly removes guilt from anyone who kills a thief in the pursuit of self-defense. Though we have logically stated its necessity in the nature of the right to self-defense, the right to arms is also explicitly upheld in the Bible by Jesus himself. In Luke 22:36, Jesus says, "But now, he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack, and he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." Now clearly, Jesus has not only upheld the right to ownership of a sword, but has also made it such an imperative to own one in the time after his crucifixion that he commands his disciples to sell their cloak to buy one if they must. This verse upholds the right to self-defense in the New Testament, as well as the right to bear arms, simply by Jesus' upholding of the right to own a sword. The ownership of the sword, combined with its purpose, can tell us that Jesus upholds the law from Deuteronomy. These are only two of many examples of human rights being upheld by the Bible, with Genesis' account of man being made in God's own image being the strongest and most compelling of all. The U.S. Constitution's preamble identifies just as much and abolished slavery in its very writing, as many of the founding fathers hoped would soon be accomplished in practice. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and more were all derived from Scripture and cited as the ultimate moral basis for the Constitution's claims. Regardless of the clear logical need for an objective morality, this does not stop some from challenging the truth of such a morality. Let's talk about some of these challenges and their failures to stand under their own weight. I must mention as a note to the viewer that these may sound like repetitions of the challenges to universal truth, and there is a reason for this. As human beings, we recognize that what is true is also good. Truth is always good and right, so that which determines your source of truth will also determine your source of morality. Moral relativism argues that moral principles are relative to individual cultures and societies. According to this view, moral rights and wrongs vary depending upon cultural norms and beliefs. Moral relativists point to differing cultural moral codes as evidence of moral relativism's legitimacy. However, this really leaves no delineation between right and wrong available, if simply citing the difference between cultures' definition of right and wrong affirms their views of right and wrong as correct. Do you mean to tell me that no culture is wrong in their moral assessments? So if every culture is right, then there can't actually be any wrong. However, the main problem with this view is that it violates the law of non-contradiction. To assert that morality is relative is an objective or universal statement, meaning that cultural relativism is applied universally to all cultures, providing a universal moral framework to work within. In moral relativism's very own assertions, it becomes itself morally objective. Consistently applied, moral relativism leaves the Germans in the 1930s and 40s to decide their own right from wrong culturally. After all, barring cultures like the US, who, with their own moral standard, pummeled them into oblivion, Germany greatly benefited financially from their actions against the Jews as their perceived enemy. Moral skepticism claims that we have no means by which to know moral truths. Of course, I must ask up front, how do you know that? Uniquely, moral skeptics do not deny the existence of universal moral principles. They simply assert that there is no way to know what they are. Of course, as I highlighted with my first question, this becomes an issue of epistemology, as the skeptic questions reality itself and what he can know and not know. Let's do a quick sidebar on moral epistemology and take the skeptic's claim to heart. If there is an objective moral value to the universe, then there must be a provider for that standard. A universe existing purely as a result of time and chance acting on matter would then leave the objective moral standard to be determined randomly by time and chance. Any objective standard derived from such a universe would lack any real objectivity, as the randomness it exhibited would lack coherence. For example, if universal standards were created by the random slot machine of time and chance acting on matter, it could become morally acceptable to kill grandma with a shotgun on a Tuesday with a full moon, but not okay to kill grandma on a Wednesday by running her over with your car. Is this kind of, quote, objective moral standard even something worth attempting to know or understand? This really nullifies any objectivity or universality such a standard would have in the first place. However, with the Bible being our epistemological anchor, we can point to God as the provider of universal moral principles and the Bible as our means to be told about them by the very God who created those standards. In conclusion, in order to have a civilized society, we must believe in universal morality. Without it, we have no effective means of telling the criminal who has violated the law that he did anything wrong. If we deny the universality and objectivity of moral standards, then the criminal who has acted without remorse or belief that he did anything wrong has just as much a legitimate claim as the state in its attempt to administer justice. And if the state has no objective standard in which it can appeal to, society ceases to be civilized as criminals roam the streets uninhibited from sowing chaos, bloodshed, and tragedy upon the society in which they preside. And let's be clear, there is a cultural movement in existence today that seeks to abolish prisons specifically due to their moral skepticism. I must say, these individuals must have watched episode 2 of this series because they are logically consistent. I imagine most of you watching this video, however, desire to see justice administered within your society and prisons utilized to protect the innocent from the violent and immoral predations of certain criminals. So, if there must be a universal standard, what is yours? How do you know it is right? Is it strong enough to withstand challenge, and can it defend itself when it inevitably strays from its original value and purpose by those who misunderstand or weaponize it? Tell me in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me in this week's very deep dive into universal morality. Please join me again next week. Remember to seek, and you shall find. And until next time, God bless.